Welcome to another episode of Holding All the Cards. My name is Daniel, go by Kiramode on the boards, and today I'm going to go over a little bit of the FAQ. I've been meaning to do a video like this for a while, but precedence hasn't really been set there, and what I really want to talk about is ripple effects when a meta-defining card gets nerfed, because some cards are more valuable than other cards in terms of how they affect other decks. So I don't want to go over too much of the FAQ. It's just more specifically with Enforced Loyalty, because Navy Fortress is basically a dead deck now. It's still fine. I mean, like, if you still want to play Tarkin and Chimera, and you like Yularen shooting back damage, and you like the Gladiators for edge, like, that doesn't change. The board pressure that Navy's able to put down is still as good as it's always been. But the downside of Navy has always been that they don't really have tricks. You know, like, everything they do is incredibly predictable. They can put you in really tough spots. Like, Tarkin can blank stuff, and the Gladiators can put you in situations where you have to win edge by going all in. The goal and defense platforms can put you in situations where you have to one-shot them with Yoda, and, you know, you're just in spots you don't like to be in. But it's all predictable. It's all things that you can calculate out. So with the right deck type, you can just pick them apart. But what's always taken Navy, like Navy Fortress in particular, what's taken it from being like this strong but predictable deck to a deck that can really just be punishing and win tournaments is that there's a certain percentage of games that are free wins. And the free wins come from Enforced Loyalty. So you're going to flop Enforced Loyalty with one protection objective. And a protection objective in this case would be either Tarkin Doctrine or Entrenched Defenses. You're going to hit that a little under 50% of the time to be able to get both. And so when you have those games, that puts your opponent in a situation where they have to respond to it. It's like, I mean, it's a terrible card design that they even had that card in the first place, but it's there. And so the only options you have is you have to have a redirect effect, like Secret Objective, Luke's Land Speeder, Han Solo, something like that. You either need that, or you need to be able to hold the force guaranteed through the first round and just eat one Enforced Loyalty shot. Now, luckily for light side players, the most commonly played pod in Force with you happens to have that, right? Like, if you go Nudge plus Yoda turn 1, commit the Nudge and Yoda, you have 7 pips on the force. It's highly unlikely that your opponent's going to be able to put 8 on their turn 2. You know, you'd have to go like Tarkin plus a guy turn 1, and then Chimera turn 2, commit Tarkin Chimera plus the other person in order to take back force. It's highly unlikely they're going to be able to get that. So most of the time, having Nudge plus Yoda turn 1 allows you to keep the force and deal the damage. The problem is that's assuming nothing bad happens. It's assuming they don't have a turn 2 Stormtrooper assault team, that they don't have an interdictor to force Yoda to block, or again, that they just don't draw incredibly well. And the thing about Enforced Loyalty is, Enforced Loyalty, any deck can eat one Enforced Loyalty shot. That's not the end of the world. Most decks have a lot of trouble, though, when there's 2 Enforced Loyalty shots that go off. And then if 3 ever go off, it's game over. So, Enforced Loyalty now, if you have it around for 3 turns, is the equivalent of only having 1 Enforced Loyalty. So that's not good. And then also it hurts Yularen and Imperial Fist as well, because sometimes players would make really bad decisions when it comes to Enforced Loyalty because they have to attack it, right? Like, people know you have to turn off Enforced Loyalty. So oftentimes you'll have players making calculus in their head, like, okay, I have to turn this off, but in order to turn it off, I'm going to leave 3 damage sitting on an objective, and I know Yularen and Fist can throw it back at me. But you sometimes just have to be in a spot where you're like, okay, well, I can't win, you know, so I just have to attack it, leave the damage on there, and just pray that they don't have it. And that's when Navy players win. When you put your opponent in a situation where they have to pray you don't have the card, and then you have the card, and you take it down. So now, the free wins that Enforced Loyalty gives you, it's not that much. Like, if you look at it from like a strictly big picture perspective, it's not everything, right? Like, I would say, so you're going to get the flop about 50% of the time. Let's say you get to actually have 2 Enforced Loyalty shots go off 50% of that time, or maybe 33% of that time. We're talking about somewhere between 10 to 15% of games are just decided on the flop for Navy. So I think you can look and say, okay, that's not that much, especially if you already view dark side as a stronger side, which a lot of people do. Like there's just a lot of people that can win strictly on the board pressure of Navy itself. But I mean, you take any deck down 10%, that's a lot, especially considering that both Sith and Scum are viable. You know, this isn't like the Gladiator nerf. So when they nerfed the Gladiators, they nerfed the best dark side deck that's probably ever been in the meta. So you take this deck that had an unreasonably high power level and knock it down to the point where it still might be the best deck. Taking Enforced Loyalty and just making it like an objective that you might not even keep anymore in your opening flop. You know, you're taking it from the deck defining objective to like just borderline trash. That's going to completely change the whole deck type. So this in effect is why I say that like Navy Fortress is dead, because also there's certain decks on light side that they just don't exist because of Enforced Loyalty. So in the same way that Tarkin kills like pilot decks or really any enhancement based deck just because he can blanket, and he kills just about all Chud based decks because of Moment of Triumph, he's really oppressive in that way. Yulari's oppressive in a different way. So for example, I have this deck that I've been messing around with where it's like half vehicles, half leaders. And the idea is like you use well paid to discount your vehicles and you use your leaders to take the force. And you can kind of play either way. The problem is the deck has no redirect, and the deck, while it can take the force, it doesn't have Yoda, so it can't like come out and like just stranglehold the force. It's more like you take the force for a turn, I take the force for a turn, but I'm eventually able to get 9 pips on the force. So I can contest the force with the best of decks. But the problem is, like, I've played a couple of games where it's like someone just has entrenched defense plus Enforced Loyalty, and I lose because the Enforced Loyalty shot goes off twice. And even though I'm eventually able to turn it off, the way I turn it off is I blow up entrenched defense and then go turn off Enforced Loyalty, which just makes it like, it makes it one of those things where your only option that you can do against that deck is just pray that they don't draw Enforced Loyalty, right? Just pray that they don't get the nuts on the flop, and then you can win. So now that deck that I've been messing with becomes viable. I think smuggler decks in particular, one of the things that's been hurting them so much in the meta right now is that you can't take the force, right? So you can't stranglehold the force like you can with Jedi. You don't have redirect effects because your only redirect card that you have in all of Smugglers is Lando or Tamtil Screech, but he's not really a smuggler card. He's really more of a rebel card because you're going to play him with the Kraken, right? So you're going to play him in a completely different deck type. And like Smugglers, if you want to play with like the Han Chewie pod, you want to play with the Falcon, you want to play with some freeholders, and maybe you play like DJC3PO, like you're playing that kind of setup, Tamtil doesn't fit in there. So now you don't have a redirect either. So you don't have the redirect, you don't have the force, and so if someone just flops Enforced Loyalty and flops Tarkin Doctrine, you lose. And so like just having that effect gone is going to really change the meta. Now the thing is, it's April, so Worlds is about a month away. Anyone that's going to Worlds has already been practicing and probably already knows what they're playing, or at least has a very good idea of what they're playing. So we're not really going to see the effect of the Yularen nerf until, you know, maybe like when Store Championships start rolling around. You know, like once like a little bit of time has passed and people start playing more decks, like once people realize that there's these decks that were in the back burner that they might be able to bring to the forefront now and say, okay, well let's give this deck another shot. It's sort of like how at some point Core Vader just left the meta, and that happened for a number of reasons, but the main one being Navy kind of took over, and then you also had Scum got a little really good cards, then GA Vader came along, and then so Core Vader just sort of drifted off. And the ripple effect of that is there are pods now that are being played that wouldn't have otherwise been played. Like for example, the Donna's pod, no one would ever play those chuds. Core Lando, more people have been messing with them because you can actually play him now. The Spec Forces ordinarily would just be fodder for Vader. Now they're in the discussion, you know, or like even something like Brainiac. I think if if Core Vader were heavily in the meta, nobody would ever play Brainiac because it's too dangerous to have like such a core piece of your deck just get picked off like that the moment that he hits the table, because Vader can just choke him and he dies. So you start adding all this stuff up with the Yularen thing, and it's really going to change things for the better. And it's like when a card like this kind of magnitude happens, I personally just love it. I just think it really allows players to get more creative, and it allows decks to just breathe. Now, if you're a Navy player yourself, if you're Brad Eamon, well, this sucks, because now defending your title became a lot tougher because your deck is now trash. But for everyone else, people like me, people like you who are probably watching, I mean, I don't know how you're not stoked about this. This is so great. And the other thing too is, I know a lot of people like this side tangent here. A lot of people don't like the restriction of holding all the cards and Zeb's objective, right? Like you just can't play them together anymore. The Nuring pairing. I actually like the restriction there, and the reason is that, I mean, we can all agree it's lazy, right? What they should do is there should be some sort of rule that just penalizes overdrawing. Now, whether you want that to be a game loss, whether you want a warning system, whether you want a reshuffle or a discard, whatever penalty you want, there should just be an established penalty for that situation, and you can just play the cards together. Like restricting those specific cards, because you're not restricting all of the instances of that, right? People could still play Embers of Hope theoretically. People could still theoretically play Zeb's objective with Moisture Vaporator to try to force out game losses. Like if people really wanted to do that, they could still do that. It's just that Against All Odds and Last Warrior, those just happen to be good pods, so people are more likely to actually play them together. But the reason I like the restriction of them is it's pretty clear to me that they just don't know what to do with regards to overdrawing. Like they don't know what the penalty is, and that's fine. You don't have to know, right? Like if you're the designer, I don't think that every single game designer should be forced to know every answer for every single weird thing that comes up. Like it is a little bit of a strange thing, especially in our game, because you can't compare discarding a card in this game to like Magic the Gathering. Hand information is way more valuable in our game than it is in almost any other game. So like just saying, oh, we'll just discard the card or discard a card at random or look at their hand or something like that, they're not analogous to something else. So I can understand people not knowing what to do. But I've always felt that your first instinct as a designer or rules person, like whoever's the person that makes the FAQs, your first instinct, if there's a problematic card in the meta, or just a weird problem at all, you should always just go straight to banning. Like ban/restriction. That should always be step one. Because you can always unrestrict cards, right? Like the Last Warrior and Against All Odds are not going to be on there forever, right? At some point they're going to find a way to penalize overdrawing that's clean and makes sense and they can implement. And once they do, the card will be taken off. That should always be your first instinct. Because the problem is, if you change the rules or you change the card and you do it too early, you can potentially just kill cards or kill certain parts of the game. So examples of this would be Gamma Run. We all know now that Gamma Run should just be Smuggler only, and while you control 3 or more Smuggler objectives, this card gains blank. That way you can't play it in Jedi, right? So you can't like be splashing in Yoda, and even if you did, you'd have to play like 8-2 off faction or something, right? Like that's always been the problem with that. Like the problem was never that there was too many hired hands or that the Marauder was too good. It was just, if you have Gamma Run with May the Force be with you, Gamma Run basically just becomes at the end of each turn draw a card, and that's just unfair to be able to do that all the time. When you pair that with Yoda and you're able to consistently get it, it didn't make much sense. But the problem is they just errated it way too quickly, right? They just changed it to limit 1 like that, and now you can't go back, right? Like you can't unerrata the card. And another example of this was like FAQ 3.6. It's easily the worst rule that's ever been made in our game, it's not worded intuitively and creates a lot of very strange rulings with the way it's worded. But we're like 3 years in, so what are you going to do? You can't just take it out of the rule book, because then you have to backdate a whole bunch of these other cards and other rulings, and so now we're just stuck with it, right? And that now we're in this spot where it's like, okay, we're just going to have a lot of weird interactions like the Ezra thing or the Lando thing, and it's all because they acted too quickly, right? Whereas like if when Executor and Killing Cold was a problem, if they would have just said, you know what, we're going to restrict these, like you just can't play these cards together until further notice, you know, then you can figure out a solution for it later. So that's where like I think when you look at the holding all the cards with the Last Warrior, it's not pretty, right? Nobody likes that they just got restricted, but it's still way better. Like it's way better that they just restrict the 2 cards until they find a good solution, versus they make a bad solution for it and they keep the cards and now they can't go back on it, and that just becomes the way the game goes. Anyways, going back to the Yularen thing though. So with Navy Fortress getting hit as hard as they did, the Navy deck that I would expect to come out of that is just a ramp version. So my favorite version of like the rampy Navy is just you use the Death Squadron Star Destroyers, you use Tarkin, you use Chimera, you use the newer ships, Admiral Screed, you know, because then you have like multiple different ships. You have the objective that lets you auto strike, and you have enough resources to make up for that paused lack of resources. So you can just build up, and you can have a boat like a 2-way deck that the only real problem with the deck is your edge hands are kind of questionable because you're deploying too much stuff on the board, so you oftentimes only have like 1 or 2 card edge hands, but that's it. That's the only problem with the deck. Everything else is money. So I think people are going to play that. But I mean, in reality though, I really think what people will do is like, especially good players, is they'll just play Scum, or they'll just play Sith, because like Scum got hit. Like Jabba, his objective no longer works 2 ways, but the thing about Scum is Scum's not as reliant on any particular card as say Sith or Navy are. Like I feel like you can make 2 Scum decks that share only 1 or 2 pods, and out of 10, right? And they'd still be really, really good. Like each one would still be good. So you could just take Jabba out of decks entirely, and the decks would still be good. Maybe you play him as one of. Like there's plenty of ways that you can still use him. Sith did not get nerfed at all, so they'll be fine. It's like, but the Navy's gone, and that's I think the most exciting thing. So hopefully, what'll happen is within the next month, that like there'll be a couple brave souls who happen to be good players, who maybe start giving Rebels a serious look, maybe start giving Smugglers a serious look, and don't just run Spark decks, don't just run like Jedi decks. You know, like they actually maybe give vehicles like a real look. Like they look for decks that aren't rush decks, aren't control decks like in the Force Lock decks, but have more of like combo potential, so we can really see what these decks can do, because now they're not going to be under the gun, right? If you want to build a deck that's built around like Rebels Hope and Judder, and like maybe you throw Hera in there, or you try to do something weird with Ballistics and a whole lot of come into play effects, those decks have a lot of explosive potential. The problem with them is that you need a lot of turns, right? You oftentimes need to be at 6 mana to be able to play all the stuff you want to play. You also need to have a big board, and you need to just have a lot of cards to be able to do all this stuff. And it might only take you like 3 or 4 turns to set up, and then you have this massive combo when you win the game. But if like you take 3 enforced loyalty shots, then you just lose. So being able to actually play those decks, I think, would be really, really interesting. So we'll see how the meta shakes out, and go on until next time.